Many people say, the problem that you have is if you're in a nightmare relationship.
The leak did not come from a palace source, it came from a hotel corridor. Days before the Invictus Games arrived in Birmingham, planners began whispering about an extraordinary accommodation request allegedly tied to Meghan Markle. Not a suite, not a wing. 4 entire floors of a Hyatt hotel, sealed, secured, and cleared of other guests. At first, officials dismissed it as an exaggeration. Then the details spread. Floor access restrictions. Dedicated elevators. Security teams operate independently of event organizers. And suddenly, a question overshadowed the games themselves. Was this about safety, status, or control? We examine how a leaked demand threatened to derail Invictus Birmingham, why the optics mattered more than the logistics, and how a story about hotel floors became a public reckoning over entitlement, reputation, and restraint. The problem did not surface during a press briefing or a planning meeting at City Hall. It surfaced inside a hotel operations office, late in the afternoon, when a routine accommodation spreadsheet was flagged for review. According to people familiar with the process, the entry did not look routine. It referenced 4 contiguous floors at Hyatt Regency Birmingham, marked for exclusive use during the opening days of the Invictus Games in Birmingham. At first, staff assumed it was an internal placeholder. Large events often block rooms early, then release them as schedules firm up. But this entry was different. It included access restrictions, elevator control, and security coordination notes that went beyond standard VIP protocols. One staff member described it as closer to a diplomatic lockdown than a celebrity booking. Within hours, questions began circulating. Who exactly required 4 full floors? Why such a large footprint for a visit centered on athletes and families? And who was authorizing the restrictions? The answers were vague, but one name appeared repeatedly in informal conversations: Meghan Markle. The timing could not have been worse. Birmingham was in the final stages of preparation. Volunteers were being briefed. Transport routes finalized. Security teams are stretched thin as they coordinate venues across the city. The Invictus Games, founded to spotlight wounded veterans and resilience, were meant to project accessibility and humility. The optics of an alleged luxury lockdown cut sharply against that message. Word reached local organizers by early evening. According to people close to the planning committee, the reaction was disbelief rather than anger. They asked whether the report was accurate. Hotel management confirmed that discussions had taken place but declined to attribute them publicly. That reluctance did not stop the story from spreading. By nightfall, the leak had traveled beyond Birmingham. London-based reporters began making calls. Social media accounts associated with royal commentary picked up the phrase 4 floors of the Hyatt and repeated it without context. The specificity gave the claim traction. It sounded too detailed to be invented, yet too extravagant to ignore. Inside the Invictus organizing team, tension rose quickly. Several members worried that the games themselves were about to be overshadowed. The antagonist, from their perspective, was not a person, but a narrative forming in real time. A story about privilege threatening to eclipse a story about service.
From an excellent source inside Invictus's, well, Harry's going to have to fight.
Prince Harry was briefed as questions mounted. According to people familiar with the exchange, his immediate concern was containment. He asked where the information had originated and whether it reflected finalized plans or preliminary discussions. The answers were unclear. In large events, preliminary discussions often harden into rumor before they harden into reality. Meghan's camp reacted with visible irritation. Advisors argued privately that security assessments were being misrepresented as indulgence. They cited past incidents, online threats, and the intensity of UK media coverage as justification for heightened precautions. From their perspective, requesting control over accommodation was not about status. It was about minimizing risk. That explanation did not travel well outside the room. British commentators framed the alleged request as excessive, almost immediately. 4 floors became a shorthand for entitlement. Panels debated whether such demands were appropriate for someone attending an event centered on wounded veterans, many of whom would be staying in modest accommodations nearby. Inside Buckingham Palace, aides monitored the coverage without intervening. The palace was not involved in Invictus planning, and officials were keen to maintain that distance. Still, the leak landed uncomfortably. Anything involving hotel lockdowns and security inevitably invites comparison with royal protocol. The palace itself was divided quietly. One faction argued that the story would burn out once clarified. Another worried that silence would allow the narrative to harden. The king was not briefed immediately. This was not yet considered a matter requiring intervention. That restraint would later become part of the story. Back in Birmingham, hotel staff felt caught in the middle. They were bound by confidentiality, but increasingly aware that the situation was becoming public. One manager described receiving calls from regular guests asking whether their reservations would be honored. Others worried about staff scheduling and emergency access if multiple floors were restricted. By the following morning, the leak had reached national newspapers. Headlines varied in tone but not substance. 4 floors demanded, Hyatt lockdown, ahead of Invictus. The repetition stripped away nuance. The allegation became a fact in the public mind, regardless of verification. Invictus organizers faced a dilemma: address the story and risk amplifying it, or ignore it and risk appearing complicit. According to people close to the committee, they chose restraint. Their focus remained on athletes. Any comment about accommodation, they feared, would redirect attention. Meghan remained silent. That silence was interpreted in conflicting ways. Supporters viewed it as a form of dignity in the face of misrepresentation. Critics saw it as avoidance. The absence of clarification allowed both interpretations to flourish. Harry attempted to refocus attention on the games themselves, emphasizing veteran stories in private conversations with media partners. But the leak had momentum. Each mention of Invictus now carried an asterisk. 4 floors? Hyatt, Birmingham. The phrase followed every update. By the end of the first day, the damage was not logistical but reputational. Whether or not 4 floors had truly been requested was almost beside the point. The idea had taken hold. In a climate already sensitive to questions of privilege and entitlement, the allegation landed hard. This was how the controversy began. Not with a demand shouted across a desk, but with a line item on a spreadsheet, pulled into the open by whispers and widened by repetition. The games had not yet begun, and already the narrative had shifted. What was supposed to be a return focused on resilience and service now faced a different test, not of security, but of perception. And as the city prepared to welcome athletes from around the world, the story of who would occupy 4 hotel floors threatened to take up far more space than anyone had planned. By the second day, the issue was no longer confined to planning rooms or hotel offices. It had become a public optics question, and optics move faster than facts. What began as an alleged accommodation request was now being interpreted as a statement of values, and that interpretation was proving difficult to contain. Event organizers in Birmingham spent the morning fielding calls unrelated to venues, schedules, or athletes. They were being asked about hotels, about security, about whether the Invictus Games were being reshaped to accommodate a single guest rather than the competitors the event was built around. According to people close to the organizing committee, the frustration was palpable. The games were days away, and attention was drifting.
The press is going to roll on, and there's very little about the Invictus. It's about, was she...
The operational reality of sealing 4 floors of a hotel became clearer as more details circulated. Entire corridors would need restricted access. Staff would require additional clearance. Housekeeping schedules would be altered. Emergency protocols would have to be rewritten. None of this was impossible, but all of it carried consequences for other guests, many of whom had booked months in advance to attend Invictus events. Hotel insiders described the scale as unusual. High-profile guests often request enhanced privacy, but entire floors are typically reserved only for heads of state or major diplomatic delegations. Applying that level of control to a private visit raised immediate questions. Who was authorizing it? Who was paying for it? And under what authority? The name attached to those questions remained Meghan Markle, and with it came an avalanche of interpretation. Supporters argued that the United Kingdom presented unique risks given its history with the British media. Critics countered that many public figures navigate similar environments without having to lock down hotels. Security analysts were pulled into broadcasts to weigh in. Some acknowledged that high-profile individuals face heightened threats, particularly when controversy follows them across borders. Others pointed out that excessive security can backfire, drawing attention and signaling importance. The debate did not resolve the issue. It reframed it. Inside Montecito, advisors worked to clarify what they described as a mischaracterization. According to people familiar with the discussions, the preliminary security assessments were leaked without context. Options discussed in early planning stages, they said, were being treated as final demands. From their perspective, the narrative of entitlement ignored the realities of threat assessment. Prince Harry echoed that frustration in private conversations. He emphasized that Invictus had always been about participant safety, including his own families. He worried that the leak was diverting attention from the veterans the Games were meant to honor. Yet even as he tried to redirect focus, the story refused to narrow.
Harry now really wants to cling hold of this, but stupid in many respects.
British media seized on the contrast. Commentators juxtaposed images of wounded service members staying in modest accommodations with headlines about sealed hotel floors. The comparison was powerful, even if incomplete. It played into an existing narrative about excess and expectation that critics were eager to revive. Social media accelerated the framing. The phrase, 4 floors of the Hyatt, became shorthand, repeated without qualification. Memes followed. Context evaporated. The antagonist was no longer a leaked document or a planning miscommunication. It was repetition itself. Invictus leadership found itself in an unenviable position. Addressing the issue risked legitimizing it. Ignoring it allowed it to grow. According to people close to the leadership team, they chose to stay silent publicly while reinforcing internally that the Games would proceed as planned, with a focus on athletes and families. That decision did little to stop speculation. Questions turned to whether the alleged request had been approved, denied, or quietly modified. The absence of clear answers invited assumption. Each outlet filled the gap differently, but the underlying tone hardened. Inside Buckingham Palace, aides continued to keep their distance. The palace was not involved in hotel bookings or event logistics, and officials were careful not to be drawn in. Still, the story's royal undertones were unavoidable. Any discussion of sealed floors and heightened security inevitably invites comparison with royal protocol. The palace's silence was read in conflicting ways. Some interpreted it as tacit disapproval, others engage in deliberate non-engagement. Either way, it reinforced the sense that Meghan was operating outside accepted norms, even if no official statement supported that conclusion. Meghan herself remained silent. Friends described her as deeply irritated by what she viewed as a distortion of legitimate safety concerns. Yet, she also recognized that responding publicly would likely entrench the narrative rather than dismantle it. Silence, in this case, was both shield and risk. Harry faced a different calculation. He worried that the controversy would overshadow Invictus entirely. In private, he urged advisors to find a way to de-escalate. The problem was structural. Once a story crystallizes around a symbol, 4 floors, bulletproof glass, locked corridors, it resists nuance. By late afternoon, the impact was measurable. Coverage of athlete profiles dropped. Headlines about logistics climbed. The Games, meant to celebrate recovery and resilience, were being framed through the lens of accommodation demands. Hotel management began quietly adjusting expectations. Tentative holds were reconsidered. Staff were told to prepare for multiple scenarios. The practical machinery of hosting a major event, adapted in real time to uncertainty, created not by weather or transport, but by perception. The antagonist at this stage was no longer a single alleged demand. It was the collision between intention and interpretation. What one side framed as security planning, the other framed as entitlement. And in the space between those frames, reputations began to absorb damage. As the second day closed, one reality was clear. Even if the alleged request was scaled back or reinterpreted, the story had already done its work. Optics had overtaken logistics. And in the lead-up to an event built on humility and service, that shift carried consequences no amount of planning could fully undo. By the third day, the controversy had reached a point where silence itself became a signal, not because anyone had confirmed the alleged request, but because no institution with authority chose to contest it. The absence of intervention reframed the debate. This was no longer a question of hotel logistics. It was a test of distance, responsibility, and restraint. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior aides were briefed early. The tone of the update was cautious. The palace had not been involved in Invictus accommodation planning, nor had it been consulted on security arrangements connected to the Games. That separation mattered. Any public comment risked implying oversight where none existed. The palace's response was deliberate non-engagement. Officials chose not to clarify, deny, or contextualize the reports. From an institutional perspective, this was consistent. The Sussexes were no longer working royals. Their logistics were not palace business. Still, aides acknowledged privately that the optics were uncomfortable. The word Hyatt, paired with 4 floors, carried echoes of royal excess that the monarchy had spent years trying to shed. The internal divide was muted but present. One faction believed the palace should quietly remind the public that Invictus is an independent charity and that accommodation decisions are handled outside royal channels. Another faction argued that even such a reminder would be interpreted as distancing in a moment that already looked like repudiation. The king was advised to stay clear. King Charles III did just that. According to people familiar with the briefings, he declined to comment, emphasizing that the games should remain the focus. His approach reflected a broader pattern since succession: intervene rarely, speak only when necessary, allow institutions to carry their own weight. Prince William maintained an even greater distance. His absence from Invictus-related planning or commentary was noted by the press. Some interpreted it as quiet disapproval, others as adherence to protocol. Either way, the silence reinforced the sense that Meghan stood alone in absorbing the backlash. Media pressure intensified as the palace declined to engage. British outlets framed the silence as tacit judgment. American commentators framed it as abandonment. The divergence widened the story rather than narrowing it. Each side projected motive onto the absence of response. In Birmingham, local officials felt the strain acutely. They were hosting an international event under a spotlight that had shifted unexpectedly. According to people close to the city's coordination team, frustration mounted that a story about accommodation was dominating coverage intended to celebrate veterans. They had no authority to clarify the alleged request and no appetite to amplify it. Invictus leadership faced a similar bind. Addressing the leak risked politicizing the games. Ignoring it risked letting the narrative define them. They chose to double down on athlete-focused messaging, increasing profiles and interviews centered on competitors. The effort slowed the bleed, but did not stop it. The antagonist at this stage was not Meghan directly. It was the perception that she was insulated from accountability while benefiting from proximity to royal symbolism. Critics argued that if she wanted privacy and independence, she should accept the limits that come with them. Supporters countered that independence should not negate safety. Meghan's silence became its own storyline. Commentators dissected her past interviews on security and media pressure, drawing lines between those statements and the current controversy. Some argued the leak confirmed long-standing concerns. Others argued it distorted them. The debate fed itself. Harry attempted, quietly, to recalibrate the narrative. According to people close to him, he pressed Invictus partners to emphasize operational independence from royal structures. The effort was sincere but limited. Once a story crystallizes around a symbol, 4 floors, it resists redirection. By late afternoon, the language of coverage shifted again. Words like shame, backlash, and embarrassment began appearing in headlines. The framing hardened. What had started as an alleged request was now being treated as a reputational misstep, regardless of verification. Inside the palace, aides monitored the tone and reached a sober conclusion. Intervention now would not protect the monarchy. It would entangle it. The cost of distance was reputational discomfort. The cost of engagement could be structural damage. The choice remained clear. As evening approached, it became evident that no clarification was coming from any official source. The palace would not step in. Invictus would not comment on accommodation. The hotel would not speak. That collective silence did not end the story. It sealed its shape. Meghan, once again, absorbed the focus. Harry remained present but secondary in the framing. The pattern was familiar. In controversies tied to optics and expectation, scrutiny often settles on the woman, regardless of who requested what or why. By the end of the 3rd day, the damage had largely been done. Even if the alleged request were later proven exaggerated or preliminary, the impression would linger. In public life, impressions often outlast corrections. The palace had chosen distance. The press had chosen amplification. Invictus had chosen restraint. And Meghan, intentionally or not, had become the face of a controversy that none of those choices could fully contain. What remained was the consequence. Not legal, not logistical, reputational. And as the games approached, that consequence threatened to follow every moment on the ground, reminding everyone how quickly support events can become battlegrounds when perception overtakes purpose. By the 4th day, the controversy had reached its most consequential phase, not escalation, but imprint. The alleged request for 4 floors had already done what no press conference could undo. It had attached itself to the event, to the visit, and most visibly, to Meghan Markle. Whether accurate, exaggerated, or preliminary, the story now traveled as context rather than a claim. In Birmingham, the Invictus Games opened against that backdrop. Athletes arrived early, many accompanied by family members who had planned and saved for months to attend. Volunteers moved between venues with practiced calm. On the surface, the event functioned as intended. Beneath it, organizers worked to keep the focus where it belonged. Every briefing began with the same instruction: do not engage, do not speculate, do not feed the distraction. Behind the scenes, the accommodation issue was quietly diffused. According to people familiar with the adjustments, hotel arrangements were modified without announcement. No floors were sealed. No visible lockdown occurred. The practical outcome suggested compromise or reconsideration, but without explanation, the change only fueled interpretation. Some took it as evidence that the original report was exaggerated. Others saw it as proof that the backlash had forced a retreat. Meghan's presence became the focal point regardless. Supporters praised her for appearing composed amid hostility. Critics framed her appearance as confirmation that the alleged demands had been about leverage rather than necessity. Every gesture was read through the lens of the leak. In public controversies, silence does not erase a narrative, it reframes it. Prince Harry moved through the opening days with visible determination. He spoke with athletes. He hugged families. He reiterated Invictus's mission in interviews that pointedly avoided logistics. Those close to him said he was frustrated that the Games had been forced to share oxygen with a story that had nothing to do with sport or service. Yet the damage was uneven. While Harry's role as founder and advocate remained intact, Meghan absorbed the sharper edge of criticism. Commentators focused on her perceived expectations, her past statements, and her proximity to luxury. The pattern was familiar. When controversies involve optics, scrutiny often concentrates on the woman, regardless of authorship or authority. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was restrained but telling. The palace did not acknowledge the controversy publicly. Privately, aides noted that the decision to maintain distance had insulated the institution. The story belonged to the event and the individuals involved, not to the crown. That separation, though uncomfortable, preserved clarity. King Charles III was briefed after the opening ceremony with a simple assessment. The Games were proceeding. The controversy had not escalated further. No intervention was required. His response reflected an institutional instinct, honed over decades. Let the moment pass. Do not widen it. Prince William was entirely absent from the narrative. That absence was itself a statement. No commentary, no gestures, no quiet reassurance. The message, intentional or not, was consistent. The palace would not be drawn into a debate about accommodation or entitlement tied to a private appearance. Media coverage began to shift as the Games progressed. Athlete stories re-emerged. Medal ceremonies reclaimed airtime, yet the earlier framing lingered. Articles referenced the controversy in passing, as background. That is how reputational scars persist, not as headlines, but as footnotes that follow every mention. For Meghan, the consequence was not formal censure or institutional rebuke. It was perception, the sense that she had misjudged the moment, even if she had not authored the request as reported. In public life, responsibility often attaches to proximity rather than proof. Being associated is enough. Friends described her reaction as controlled and inward. There were no public rebuttals, no defensive statements. That restraint may have prevented further escalation, but it could not reverse the narrative already set. Once shame becomes a framing device, it reshapes how subsequent actions are read. Invictus leadership expressed relief as the week progressed. The Games had survived the distraction. Athletes remained the heart of the story. Yet privately, organizers acknowledged the cost. Planning energy had been diverted, messaging had been diluted. An event built on humility had been forced to contend with a narrative about excess. The antagonist in the end was not a person or a hotel. It was symbolism. 4 floors became a metaphor, not for what happened, but for what people believed it represented. In controversies driven by optics, metaphors are more powerful than facts. As the Games closed, the immediate storm faded. What remained was residue. Future visits would be viewed through this lens. Any security request, however modest, would be addressed immediately. The boundary between precaution and privilege had been blurred in the public imagination. This is how reputations shift. Not through definitive proof or official findings, but through accumulation. A leak, a phrase, repetition, silence. adjustment. The sequence matters more than the accuracy of any single element. Meghan left Birmingham with the games intact, but her image altered. Harry left, having protected Invictus, but not entirely shielded it. The palace was left untouched, having chosen distance over defense. Each outcome followed from earlier choices. In royal-adjacent life, support events carry unusual weight. They invite moral expectation alongside public scrutiny. When logistics intrude, they are rarely judged solely on practicality. They are judged on symbolism. The 4 floors did not define the games, but they defined the controversy. And in the space between service and spectacle, that distinction mattered more than anyone involved had anticipated. This is how a story ends without resolution, not with confirmation or denial, but with a quiet recalibration of how a figure is seen. In public life, that recalibration can be the most lasting consequence of all. When logistics leak, they become symbols. If you want deeper investigations into how reputation, power, and perception collide behind closed doors, subscribe, share your perspective, and join us as we continue unpacking the stories that shape public moments before the cameras ever roll.